Alright, what's up everybody? It's the Scotty P Breakdown, and I'm here with Abraham LaMontagne?
LaMontagne. Yeah.
LaMontagne, okay, That makes sense. The mountain. Well, dude, so you're a purple belt in Jiu Jitsu. You have a master's degree in biochemistry. You also dance in your spare time. You're one of the most, just from like social media and our few interactions that we had training together, you're like, you have your hands in so many different things. So you're a very interesting personality. But yeah, man, what else do you do?
Well, I just kind of have a scientific background. Essentially, I studied biochemistry for like a long time. I'm currently 29, but I was in a PhD program in the University of Oklahoma. I was in that for about 4 years, then ended up leaving it when COVID happened, and then did a lot of research, did tissue engineering, nanoparticle research. I was doing viral engineering. I worked with stem cells. I've done a lot of different kind of research like that. Most recently, I've worked in like a sales position at a big biotech company where I sold specialized equipment and assays to like researchers who did similar work to what I used to do. So more of a social role, like basically having to be a communicator. I guess something that is kind of interesting is I speak a few different languages, semi-fluently I should say. I can speak Spanish, but usually the one that people find really strange is I can speak Mandarin Chinese fairly well.
Right. Okay.
But yeah.
Damn, that's cool. And then you were also in the service, right? So
I was also in the military. Yeah, I was in the Army for 6 years.
And so I feel like that's kind of why we're able to connect, man. You know, jiu-jitsu, the military, and I always can appreciate someone with extensive knowledge, because that quote that says, you don't want to separate the scholars from your fighters or your warriors, or you'll have your country led by cowards and your fighting done by dummies.
Essentially, you want people that have some level of wisdom and experience with dealing with bullcrap, like dealing with hardship and stuff, making like executive decisions. Because I do think that's oftentimes kind of a problem we have today, is that you meet a lot of people who have a lot of their knowledge from books but not from life. And you can tell, well, I Googled that, I saw this sort of thing, and then you're like, but how did you really learn it? Because it's, I've heard some people say that a lot of people don't earn their wisdom, they just read it and they're like, now I know it. And so it's just like, but they didn't really go through the experience of the situation. And maybe that's something, I mean, this is just me thinking off the top of my head, but maybe that's because people don't read fiction enough anymore. They don't read stories, because maybe like reading a fact in a nonfiction book is one thing. Being like, oh, you shouldn't do this, or studies say that people who do this habit have this kind of a benefit. But maybe that was kind of one of the benefits of fiction, is because as a narrative, you can see yourself as the character and almost half learn the lesson, because you're not doing it, but you can see a character in a book do it, and it's almost like thinking about it. So
dang, that's trippy as shit.
Yeah, if you think about it. So it's like one benefit to thinking is like we can essentially create simulations in our head without thinking about it. So, with thinking about it, but without actually doing it, I should say.
Yeah, no, it makes so much sense on why like it's important for these movies to portray like these deep like connections of our reality. I was talking to it just yesterday on the podcast with Drew Weatherhead, and we were talking about how so many movies have like these deep understandings of our reality, and it's like, just to your point, instead of just coming out right and saying it, it holds so much more weight when it's put into like a story form, or the hero's journey.
Well, it's funny because I think so many people look at stories and we're like, yeah, like, I mean, I've listened to like Jordan Peterson and like things like that, so admittingly I think I'm just going to be regurgitating some things that he's come to conclusions as well. But it's like, we watch like The Lion King, or we watch like stories, and we just accept that, yeah, it makes sense, talking lion, perfectly reasonable. Yeah, he's fighting. Oh, his best friend is a meerkat and a little warthog. Makes sense. Perfectly logical that they're all eating bugs. But you have to like kind of look into the deep of that. It's almost like Simba's this estranged prince in a kingdom where essentially his best friends are kind of like these people you wouldn't expect to be friends. So everybody's always got those, the outliers of society. And then he's kind of a hippie, because sort of like the closest thing to a vegetarian a lion could actually be is eating bugs, I guess. And so he like learns some sort of Eastern philosophy kind of thing. But then he comes back and he's like Macbeth, and comes back and retakes his kingdom and everything like that. So he's the forgotten lost prince that comes back and rekindles his kingdom and continues the lineage. And that's how it is, but we all see ourselves as Simba in some way. I mean, people are kind of egotistically minded, to a certain degree, because if they weren't, they'd probably just kill themselves immediately. But if they had some sort of an ego, then they would see themselves as a character in a story. We relate to them. We champion those people.
Right, dude.
Yeah.
So Lion King's like one of my favorite movies, if not my favorite movie.
Yeah.
So hearing you talk about it, man, that's super interesting. I completely agree, man. Like with what you're saying about the stories and how they pretty much talk about like these deep archetypes within ourselves and why that's important. Another thing I want to talk to you about is, so I do a lot of comparisons with Jiu Jitsu and dancing, but I personally don't dance. I just really appreciate the skill set, and in my mind, when it comes to drilling, people take the drilling aspect almost like they're like going live, or they're always
not
like,
serious enough, or too serious.
Too serious.
Yeah, like, bro, like you need to like
relax.
Come on, man.
They're like, they do the move and they're like, it's like, dude, you can't. You're not getting it right, buddy. And the only way that you're gonna get it right is if you relax and slow down. And I compare it to dancing in a sense that, like, if I was learning dancing, I would, I wouldn't be moving somebody all weird. I try to like move with them. It's like, when you go with a white belt or a blue belt and they're almost like resisting you on the move, and it's like, buddy, move with me, dude. Like, or they'll say something silly like, oh, but I would never do that. And it's like, well, that's not what we're working on right now.
Yeah, it's like, well, I wouldn't do that reaction. It's like, bro, you're a white belt. You don't know what you're gonna do. And it's like, because I don't know what you would do. Like, well, I think I said this before. Kind of like, I like dancing and doing jiu-jitsu because I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin. I say jokingly that you could say grappling or fighting, the goal is to stop dancing, whereas the goal of dancing is to stop fighting. And so essentially, like, because if you kind of look at two people, like, at least in grappling anyway, the first thing they do is they start mirroring each other and they start following each other, and so they're essentially both fighting over. So in social dancing, or where there's a couple, you have a lead and you have a follow, and essentially two people, when they're fighting, are trying to fight over who's leading the other. So I'm trying to make the other guy my follow. And so in dance, what happens oftentimes where it's an issue is that you will like run into each other or do things like that, where you're both like essentially leading, but like essentially you're trying to convince them to be more symmetric with you, as opposed to asymmetry, which is what's naturally occurring. Where in fighting, the best thing you can do is try to be symmetric, because it at least negates any sort of advances that they can make, right? So that's kind of the way I look at it. People ask me sometimes, like, how does dancing affect your like jiu-jitsu? I bet you have great footwork. And I'm like, coordination, I think, is always going to be an important thing. Dancing is like that. I think it's not like I come out and I just start doing this like super shuffle in front of them and I'm like, cha, like, because it's especially weird, because I think usually whenever we've thought of like dancers applying it to like fighting, it's usually like a striking sport. But obviously it's very different in jiu-jitsu, because it's funny, because like I do dance salsa, but salsa, the thing I actually specialize in, the thing is called central bachata. And so central bachata is a much more intimate, close kind of, it's more grapple-like, I guess I would describe it. Salsa, you just kind of like, there's disconnections constantly. It's faster tempo. I'd say it has like more of like a fiery kind of energy to it. Whereas like central bachata is that thing that you get lost at 2 a.m. and you guys are just like kind of touching foreheads and stuff sometimes. And it's funny because in jiu-jitsu there's connection, but the connection is antagonistic, and you guys are kind of fighting over who's going to be the dominant force in that case. Whereas in like bachata or central bachata, I'd say you guys are trying to like kind of meld together. Where jiu-jitsu, it's not really like that. You're kind of like forcing the other person to meld into you, but they're kind of reluctant to do it. So like when you're getting into side control on somebody and they're like stuck there, they're like unwillingly connected to you. So right. Yeah. How
you're comparing the dancing, you want to create symmetry, and then the fighting, you don't want to create the symmetry. Well, so one time we got paired up against each other. It was as a possible matchup. It was like right before I got hurt, so I was like looking at your Instagram and trying to figure out, what my matchup would be like. And one of the things that was just kind of caught my attention is on your profile you had
yin and yang
fighting
thing.
Yeah, fighting was yang, and dancing, or no, fighting was yin and dancing was yang.
I had the order was essentially the more masculine was associated with dancing, and then the feminine one was associated with fighting. Right. And I guess the reason for that is I think a lot of people think of dancing as like a very feminine type thing, because there's girls involved, I guess would probably be the reason, or emotional expression for some reason is limited to females, I guess. But I'd actually say that the contrast, especially in couples dancing, is I have to be even more of a man with other women around, because the contrast, it's like essentially like darks seem darker when you have it right next to white, is kind of the way I look at it. So that's how I interpret it, because when I'm doing dance, I have to be even more masculine to control the situation, whereas like in like fighting or jiu-jitsu, let's say, I have to switch between aspects of both. I have to be, when I define like femininity in that context, I'm defining it as like creativity, new ideas, going outside the box. Like kind of like if I do stuff that's predictable in jiu-jitsu, I'm gonna get caught. You know what I mean? So I find that the feminine aspect is that I have to constantly come up with new things. I have to be unpredictable. I can't be, I have to be very creative, and almost a sense of chaos has to kind of ensue in order for me to establish order. So, but there's a little bit of each in the other, which is where I think the yin and yang concept comes from. It's not purely one, purely the other. That within order there is a sense of chaos, and within chaos there's, or potential order, you could say. So.
Right. Well, and then one of the things that I really notice about the comparison of the two is like something one of my old instructors would say is like, a lot of times you have to be very flamboyant in your movements. Mm-hmm. Like if you're trying to clear off someone's foot off your hip, you can't just like push it and then pull it out, right? You kind of gotta like really like
sell it.
Yeah, and that's you see that a lot in dancing. Mm-hmm. Whereas jiu-jitsu, that can kind of get lost because everything's like, well, you want to do it strong, you want to do it fast, and so everyone kind of like moves in like this choppy, blocky type of manner.
Well, it's almost like they're trying to flex like every muscle they have at the same time when they're doing it, and they're like, they equate effort to ability. And so it's like, just because you're trying as hard as you can means like, oh, the harder I try, it's a compensation for focus. But it's, in actuality, it's not. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it takes a kind of a tempered mind to really break down all the motions and then have that specificity required for the proper movement. And I think that's oftentimes why you see people who grow up doing athletics, they just immediately, when they switch to a different sport, they do so well, is not because like, wow, that guy's got a great bench press. It's because that guy's been doing like muscle coordination his entire like life. You know what I mean? It's like why they would actually equate dancers to being good fighters, I think, is because they recognize the similarity between the two skills.
So Izzy, you know what I'm talking about? The 205-pound, or was it 185-pound former champion for the UFC? Israel Adesanya. He was saying that one of the major benefits, so he's like a prolific dancer, I guess you would say. Mm-hmm. I guess more like the breakdance style.
I see him do some crazy stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, he was saying that one of the major benefits that he gets from dance is the memorization aspect. That dancing requires a lot of memorization, where it's like constantly doing the same thing over and over and over again until it becomes like second nature.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Do you notice that in your translation?
I think it depends on what you define as dance, I guess, because I'll be honest, I would not dance just by myself. Like if I'm in the kitchen, I'm like, oh yeah, this is great and everything like that, but I like dancing in the context of the connection with other people. So it's almost like you'd say that like it's a common thing you actually see. So I specialize in Latin dance, I should say, but you see it. Interesting thing about the Latin dance community, and I guess this is common in a lot of couples-based dance dance styles, essentially, is that there's a social dance community, which is where people go out on a Thursday night or a Saturday or something, and it's not really the club, but it's like a bar or something where there's like hundreds of people and everybody is there and they're just like, enjoying themselves. They're having a good time, but they're there to like meet a girl, meet a guy, do whatever, and they ask some person. It's like a high school dance but for adults, like that kind of thing, and people actually dance. But there's like a formal way of dancing, whereas the other side of it is people who perform, and so less of that is about the connection between two people, and it's oftentimes the connection is what I say I bring from dancing to jiu-jitsu, is that kind of like that flow and that feedback where like when someone is like tying up with me, I can anticipate their motions because I'm so used to like basically feeling a follow, fight me or go with me, that I can kind of tell when someone is fighting against me or going to go with my directions, which maybe could lead to a slide by or like a high knee pick or something, right? Whereas I think when you're talking about the Israel Adesanya case, I've done that, but I'll be honest, it's like my least favorite way to dance because it doesn't feel creative. It's just like burning essentially something into your like neurons. It's like, oh well, I'll do this step, and it's like one of those necessary evils. It's like drilling is like eating your vegetables in jiu-jitsu. Like, we just got to keep doing it. And the minute you recognize that it's a useful skill is the minute you know that you just got to do it. Like, it's like, I don't think anybody just like goes in there like, yeah, we're doing another arm drag for the 1,000th time in a row. But eventually you're going to be able to hit that arm drag live because of all those repetitions. So
Right, where it becomes second nature.
it's important, but it's just like, but I think that's part of the difficulty or the challenge of any sort of physical ability is you have to spend time. Like, that's why they say the 10,000 hours. It doesn't take 10,000 hours to understand concepts, but it takes 10,000 hours to incorporate them. You know what I mean? And so for whatever reason, at this point, we're limited by a biological ability to absorb that and then instill it in our physical applications.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about, you mentioned earlier about how, someone can translate from one sport to jiu-jitsu because of the coordination.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed that a lot. I used to play a lot of basketball. Like, I was obsessed with basketball. I tried to sleep with the basketball in my hands, and I would play every day until my leg.
You're just like...
Yeah. And one of the major things that I noticed is that I like to pass on my feet. And when you train in like a classic school or just a regular jiu-jitsu school, people take offense to that because...
Passing on the feet?
Right. If you're like rolling, it's just because everyone was almost like this relaxed sense where it's like, oh, you're going to play top position and then you're going to come inside my guard or my half guard. And just for me, naturally, it was always made sense where it's like, oh, I would never be on my knees, so I'm going to start on my feet.
Yeah, I've never liked passing on my knees, but I have recently started to explore body lock passing, and I've really started to like that. Like, I was like, oh, okay, this is good. But I do think the default of most people is like 90% of people who do jiu-jitsu are not competitors, they're hobbyists. And so I think that, dude, when they try doing Toriandos, especially if they don't know the right technique, they're not going to be immediately rewarded for it. So they kind of are like, this is tiring. Stepping side to side or even just going one side. They're like, wow, this is like really frustrating. And then some dude with legs just touches you and pulls you in and you're like, well, I think I'll just go on my knees. Right. So especially with the prevalence of leg locks in the sport right now, like the main thing you do to a standing opponent is you try to attack his legs. So right. Yeah. So everybody's hyper worried about that, I think. But to what you were saying is that, your athleticism that you like came from like basketball, of course. I'm sure if a guy was a big rugby, like you, I remember I was just rolling with a football player the other day. I don't know if he was like a college wrestler. I think he maybe mentioned he used to be in the NFL or something like that. The dude literally just tried to like football tackle me repeatedly from like, I was just like, I see how big and burly this dude. The dude looked like Superman if Superman also did PEDs. Like, and I was just like, okay. And so then I'm like sitting here, like my default when I see a guy who's super jacked is I do not try to wrestle with them because for all I know I'm gonna get blast doubled through next week. I sit down and I'm conserved and I'm like, all right, buddy, and I try to make my safe attachments. But this guy literally just like a bulldog is just like running straight into me, and I'm just like, okay, like. But I remember I felt the football in his guard passing. You know what I'm saying? It's the same thing. Use what you got, right?
Right. Man, one time I had this match. It was at 10th Planet Austin, and maybe I misheard the guy, but I could have swore because I told him he's like, you don't mind if I record, right? And he was like, oh no. And I swear he was like, I don't really know anything, or I'm new. And dude, we go, and I went to just like, oh, he's new, he doesn't know anything. I'm just gonna get a simple single leg. And I go for the single, dude. He snaps me down, puts me in head and arm, and is like just doing these advanced, like he has like this grip, and that's like a modified head and arm.
Think about that a bit.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, and he's, I pull him in my deep half, and he's like switching his hips on me, and I'm like, dude, there's no way. And he's jacked.
Is he a wrestler?
Like, I have no idea. I mean, it felt like he wrestled before.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, that happens, right? So you have somebody who comes out and says, oh yeah, I don't really know much jiu-jitsu, but then they blast double you, and you're like, especially the biggest sign is like a high crotch. As soon as I see someone doing a high crotch, I'm like, bruh, you had to train that. Like nobody just intuitively does high crotches, like something like that. But I totally feel what you're saying.
Yeah, so he was like just hitting me with like these different counters. It took me, I mean, I got him and I was able to get to his back, but it like took me all of 5 minutes, and it was just, it's one of those things where you almost can never like go light with anybody because you just never know
what's going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like I don't know, it's really interesting because I feel like as I've kind of started to change into what I would consider much more of a professional approach to jiu-jitsu, like at one point I would have called myself just kind of casual hobbyist doing jiu-jitsu maybe 3 or 4 times a week, and then I kind of got more and more addicted to now I'm training at least once a day, lifting like a few times a week, and many times my aim is to usually train twice a day, where I take much more of a professional mindset. I'm like, kind of hate that I have to do it, but I feel much more particular about who I roll with now. Because I'd like to just be like slap, be like, hey, whatever, cool, let's go. Because I used to do that when I was like a white and blue belt, or when I first started, and I was like, all right. But now I'm like genuinely like, okay, I have a certain volume I have to meet every day, and oftentimes I overdo it. Like I typically overdo it rather than underdo it. I don't know if it's just my mindset, or jiu-jitsu's like super, super difficult to manage, like volume. Like you're like, okay, I'll get one roll with Bobby over there, and he's about like 6 units of volume, and then I'll get like one with like Todd, and Todd is like 17, like, you know what I mean? But then you're like, I only have 50 today, like, you know what I mean? But you know, you got to get certain positions in, and then they could be a 6 one day, and then they're a 20 another, like, you know what I mean? You're like, man, I hope I get Phil on his like weekday, like, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I've been kind of like trying to manage like being overtrained and stuff like that. So it's very interesting, but I think it also kind of changes the, like, as you try to become much more professional about it, the reward you get from the sport is very different. Because it used to be just kind of like casual, nice way to meet friends and stuff like that and chill. And I still get a lot of that aspect and a lot of that brotherhood. But now, like, the real payoff is winning. Like, if you win, it feels amazing. But like back in the day, I think there was less expectation to win, and so that lower expectation was like I mean, the lower expectation makes it so the wins aren't as a big a deal. Like I don't know how to describe it, like, because I feel like there's more on each fight that I have now than before, where I could kind of just go in, and if I lost, I lost, but if I won, it was like, oh great, good job you, because they didn't take it as seriously, you know what I mean? But now people are like, yeah, Abe's got to maintain like a reputation or something like that, but that's a trade-off. Whereas I think before, I think you were able to just kind of like go to an open mat, have fun, do that kind of thing, casual about it, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, no, 100%, dude. Well, dude, so let's transition to like philosophy. I noticed that you do like a little bit of traveling. I don't know how much, but I've seen you like be in like Greece maybe, or where was
I was in Italy and Vienna. I was in Austria and Vienna last October. So it was actually the first time I left the country. Like, I'd never left the country before that, but I went to Vienna, Austria, and then I went to Rome. I was there for 2 weeks, 1 week in each place, but it was pretty cool. Vienna was actually my favorite of the two. I actually really thought the city was extremely clean, and it was very German in that way. I thought it was beautiful. It was really cool to kind of like, I think Austrian history is something that most people don't really think about or know very much about, but they used to be kind of like the biggest deal. Like back in the day, they had this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, and essentially the Habsburg family was like sitting at the head of that for like the longest time. There was I want to say it was King Charles. He was the Spanish guy who inherited the Habsburg throne, because the Habsburgs had somebody in the Spanish family, and then that dude literally owned like the Netherlands, all of modern day Germany, Austria, northern Italy, and Spain, and I think Portugal or something. But he literally like owned like half of Europe at one point, just because he was related to a bunch of people. And you know, but you go into Vienna and you kind of don't realize that, because you're like, oh, Austria, that's where Arnold Schwarzenegger's from, right? Like, but it's literally like this. It felt like I was in like a Disney movie, like walking around it. You're like, this is literally where they would like set this stuff. So I liked Vienna a lot. I thought Vienna was awesome. Coffee was great. Chocolate was good. Every aspect. The pastries were amazing. It's funny because I feel like the food, the regular food, is like bar food. It's like they have schnitzel, which is basically country fried steak, but they put cranberry sauce on it instead of like a gravy. So it was good, but I was like, it didn't seem very exotic compared to like, since I'm from the Midwest, like it's like Wisconsin food basically. So yeah.
It makes sense. That's funny. Well, so like, and I saw you like visited like some cool, was it like churches or something? It was like you were posting some philosophy quotes, and you're exploring some cool.
Yeah, you're referring to, I think it was St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, which was really cool. I saw a bunch of churches, but to be honest, like I preferred the ones in Vienna, even though I went to Rome, which would be like the capital of Christianity for Catholicism and stuff. I preferred the intimacy of the cathedral in Vienna. Maybe it's because there were like less people there at the time, but I enjoyed, like, it was also like the first like super cathedral I ever entered, where I literally felt like the awe of like, oh my God lives in this building. Like, you know what I mean? Like walking in, they were playing like the organ music and everything. I feel like it was just like the stars aligned and I got the perfect introduction to a cathedral. It was kind of cool because I think it was a much more Gothic vibe. Whereas like, I feel like when I was in Rome, when I went into, I think it's St. Peter's Basilica, I felt like it was like a shopping mall for God. Like it was great to see like all the great art and everything, but it's almost like it's so common that it doesn't seem special in a way, where I'm like, oh, another picture of Mother Mary, oh, another picture of Jesus, oh great. Like I think it's called the Pietra, but like they have the biggest Pietra there. It's Mary and she's like holding Jesus like just after he died, and she's ginormous and she's carrying him, and it was made by I think like Michelangelo, but he made it when he was like 24. And it's beautiful, but you're like seeing like 1,000 people in your view when you see it, so you can't really get like lost in the image of this. So I thought all of it was really cool, but you're almost like just constantly getting like astounded everywhere you go, that you're almost like normalize everything while you're there. Whereas I felt like there was more contrast in the dips when I was in Vienna, where I was like, oh, cathedral, but you're like walking by like Mozart's house and it's like, oh, it just looks like a house, but Mozart lived there. And the same thing, the church kind of like creeps up on you, and then all of a sudden, so yeah, so I would say in that way.
Dang, yeah, that's interesting, man. Those are places I want to visit one day. I was able to go around the world when I was in the Marine Corps, and I feel like I just wasn't able to appreciate it that much, you know? It's like...
Well, where'd you go?
I went to Guam, Thailand, Hong Kong, Oman, Djibouti, Jordan. But all those places were really quick. I would say like I really got to experience like the culture in like Thailand and Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. But it's like, you know, when you're 19 years old and you've been on deployment, all you want to do is fucking drink and just like party and stuff. You don't really like, I wish I would have, you know, or if I go again, I would rather like go see like some sights or something and really take in, you know, the culture and stuff like that. Whereas before I was just trying to chill.
Yeah, you're just having fun because you're trying to live out that college phase abroad. But the thing is that it might as well have been in like Idaho at a college town than like Hong Kong. Like so it's kind of funny because I feel like that's like, you know, it's natural. Like a 19-year-old rebellious guy, you know, you're probably, if you're in the military, super restricted. Like you don't get to, you know, you can't just unwind all the time. They tell you this is when you do this is where you go, you got to get up early, and then you kind of just want to like cut loose, you know. And being drunk in Hong Kong, surprisingly, is probably not that different than being drunk like at a college party. So, you know.
Exactly.
Especially if it's you're with nothing but Americans probably anyway. So it's like, really, what's the difference?
You don't really get to like interact with the people or anything like that because you're just surrounded by other Marines and you're just going to bars and stuff.
I guess that's something that I'm really happy about, in the sense that I always felt regretful that I never got to travel when I was younger, but I also don't think I would have appreciated it, like in the sense that when I went just this last year, so I'm 29, I think I was 28, but it was like around my birthday's in October, so it was around that time, and essentially I knew a lot more about the places I was going before I had gone, but I know if I went when I was like 16, I've been like, oh, Coliseum, there's movies about it, like, you know what I mean? But I wouldn't have known any history or spoken any languages that would have helped me. I couldn't connect to the people. But I'd say when I went to Rome, it was a pretty fulfilling experience. Like, one thing that's really nice about Jiu Jitsu and dancing is I made the effort to do it in both places. So I went to Vienna, I was, you know, I danced, I did all that stuff. It was a great way to get out of the touristy part of the cities and just immediately start talking to locals. And then I'm just this random American guy that they're like, you know, it was actually one thing that was kind of funny is I've never been mistaken as like the natives of a country before. Like someone came up to me and immediately started speaking German, and it was weird to be in a situation where they would assume I spoke German, and I had to keep explaining to them that I didn't, in like my broken German. Or like in Italy, it was the same thing. They'd come up to me and they'd be like, oh, ciao, and I'd be like, oh, I don't speak, Italiano, like that kind of thing. And I was trying to make do with my broken Spanish, and so I was just like, I speak Spanish, but I speak like Latin Spanish, not Spanish. So that was an interesting thing to kind of like deal with. Like made me really appreciate being in America, because after 2 weeks I was like, man, I just want to speak my main language. Like, because I actually normally really like to speak other languages, but I also have the comfort of knowing that later I can just go talk to this guy and default to English when I want. So I started to really feel for people who don't have the best language and they're in another country, so they can't connect. Like, cause there's like, I remember feeling like really lonely. Like when I was in Rome, it was great that I could dance with them because dancing is like its own language where we could do it. But then I remember they would be like, we'd finish the dance and they really liked it, and then they would ask me in Italian, like, whatever. They'd be like, oh, where are you from? All this stuff. And I could only have superficial conversations. You could never get really deep with them in a verbal sense. So you always had to rely on it in the physical dance sense. So
yeah,
it was interesting in that way to kind of be in that situation. So.
Right. Yeah. My girl Tori, she speaks Spanish really well, and she's very experienced with dealing with other people of like different nationalities who don't speak English that well, and yeah, she's always like relating that to me in the sense that like people who can't speak English that well, it's like hard for them to relate, and it's very common, especially when you're in the service industry, that people mistake people's inability to understand as like being rude, but it's honestly because they just like aren't that great at speaking English, or they just have like a different way of like being, because of like Russians, they have like a different demeanor than Americans do.
100%.
And the distranslation, the inability to translate, can sometimes appear as if they're like rude, but they're just different.
Or just they like not as intelligent as they might seem is another thing. Like, not that it actually is, but I think it just comes from our own ability to have subconscious like readings of people. Like when I see a guy and, because if, let's say a native English speaker spoke really broken English to us, like he's drunk or something, be like, this guy doesn't seem mentally stable. We don't have a real filter that says this guy's Russian, so let's give him like plus 20 IQ in our head. It's really just like we judge it based off of their ability to communicate. And also verbal intelligence, I think, is oftentimes prioritized over other forms of intelligence, as like, that guy's really smart. He knows braggadocious. Like, you know what I mean? He knows a big word, so he must be really intelligent. And so it's kind of like that. But like, I don't know, I've seen some people. I have my one friend, his name's Bruno, and it's kind of funny because I think he actually, he's Portuguese. I know this dude can speak English better than he actually leads on, but he like almost uses his broken English to kind of like get away with things, I feel like, when he talks. But he's literally one of the funniest people I've ever met. But I'm like, this guy knows better. But he admits it sometimes. Like he'll be like, yeah, I do, but like people find it endearing when I talk like this, so he does it intentionally. But it was really funny to see kind of like that 4D chess he played with his language. But no, Bruno's awesome. So he's also a Jiu Jitsu player. He's like a former European champion.
Oh, damn.
And so he's really talented, especially in the gi. But he came and he stayed with me for a few months, and me and him got pretty close. He's a cool guy.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
That's what's up. Tell me some like your favorite like philosophy quotes, or like things that you've gotten from philosophy that you kind of like guide your life with.
I feel like I've gone through a lot of philosophical rebirths, I guess you could say. Like I grew up Protestant and stuff like that. And essentially I remember, like, just to give you like the short version of a long period of time, Christian guy who joined the military, had like, a very conventional way of thinking and stuff like that, go to church all the time, do that kind of thing. Then, go through the military, I go to college after that, and then I kind of like distanced myself a bit and just tried to explore the things. I was totally a hippie for like a little while, like, overly open-minded, I'd say. Like, I felt like I was really restricted, got open-minded, and I was literally talking to people about energies and stuff, trying to figure out that kind of thing. And, it's kind of embarrassing to talk about, but I actually felt like, I'm like, oh, maybe you can talk to plants or something like that. And I'm like sitting here, I understood what I was getting at, but I think that I was just trying to connect with people. So I was just trying on like different outfits for like a little bit. And then after that, I think the flip is when I started to actually kind of study. I got really into like Ayn Rand for a while, and objectivism, if you're familiar with that. She wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged and like a bunch of other books.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's essentially like objectivism is like it's kind of like semi-modernized empiricism, where essentially if I can't see it, if I can't interact with it, it's not real. And so by default, she kind of like assumes the identity of an atheist at that point, because she's like, well, I can't see God, so God, needs to prove himself to me if it's real. And she kind of like leads on to other things where she sort of decisively says that there's no way a God could exist because X, Y, and Z and stuff. And it's fairly interesting, but I remember one thing I thought that was really interesting about when I was a hippie, I didn't get like anything done, and I didn't get like had the best grades or anything like that. I was in college and I was kind of bombing. And but once I kind of like abandoned that and I started taking much more of the objectivist mindset, I started waking up at 4 a.m. I started like going to bed at like 8:30 at night. I stopped partying. I stopped doing any of that. I kind of lost a lot of friends in the midst of doing that, but I got like way more efficient. I was like really fat when I was a hippie too, because I didn't do anything like really controlled. Like I'd work out, like lift weights here and there, but I was kind of a lazy, not really thinking about anything. I don't know if it was laziness, but more of just like too much going with the flow. But then when I made my life really rigid, I felt like I was able to start to objectively analyze my life and start to be like, oh, okay, I'm fat, so now I need to eat less. Okay, I need to exercise more. And I started measuring everything. I did that for a while, but it took like, I had like a GPA of like 2.4 in undergrad when I was like the hippie mode, and then once I turned to objectivist, like 3.6. I got like a 3.6 in a year, and if I didn't do that, I probably couldn't have gone to grad school. I would have probably like only been able to have the grades necessary to have just a bachelor's degree, I guess. So I was thankful for that, but I couldn't sustain doing that for very long, because I noticed when I went to grad school, I tried doing the objectivist thing, waking up at 4 a.m. and everything like that, and I noticed I overly relied on my familial relationships to kind of deal with me being kind of a jerk. So like essentially, like I was like, well, that doesn't matter because this X, Y, and Z, and I was very like, certain about things, and I didn't leave any room for nuance. So I kind of found that when I went to grad school in Oklahoma, I had to kind of like find somewhere in the middle between the two, to where I had to have objective standards for things and be much more rationally minded about it. But I couldn't forget like senses of spirituality and connection with people, because I noticed I had a hard time really connecting with people when I was doing the objectivist thing, and I overly relied on my blood-based relationships, like my little brother and my older brother and stuff, to kind of like be there and be nurturing. And when I moved really far, I couldn't talk to them regularly, so I had to like learn to make new friends all over again. So kind of like that. But ever since then, I've just been kind of like open to a lot of stuff, but I still have principles that I find I use more of a pragmatic way of approaching life now, where I think that kind of like I judge things based off the fruit that they bear, that if doing this approach doesn't yield me the kind of meaning or purpose or that zone-like feeling, then I try to kind of steer away from it because it doesn't seem to be very useful, if that makes sense.
No.
So I know that's a really long-winded response to that, and I know there's probably a million things to go into that, but that's a general way of looking like the last 10 years of my life. So.
Hell yeah. You got to be, well-read to kind of really like go back and forth between, the different styles of like ways to live life. And so you're one of the few people that I feel like I can really talk about, like one time when we were talking about the yin and the yang, that it's like from the Tao, right? And then I just noticed in my own personal life is that like there's like stoicism, and then like you're saying the pragmatism, what was it called? Objectivism, yeah. And then you have Buddhism, all these isms, and it's like they all have like their different approaches to living life, but if you really get to like the core, they're all saying like very similar things, just in a different way. And so what would you say, do you have any opinions on like maybe something that you've learned about like Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, or just like how you're talking about how you've been going between objectivism and
other things, all kinds of stuff, right? So kind of like what we reference, like when I use the term yin and yang, like essentially, or yin and yang, essentially it's all focused on the idea of the Tao. And I'm not a Taoist by anything, like by any means, but I would say that I like what the Tao, like I like it as a concept. So essentially what the Tao is essentially, it's supposed to be this balance between, it's a dualistic principle in the sense that it's opposites. That you recognize when you kind of believe in something like the Tao, you recognize that there's like black and white, there's feminine and masculine, there's light and dark, and that, I think people typically assign good and evil, but those are opposites, but I don't think it's appropriate because the yin and yang are not inherently negative or positive in the sense that they're like evil or good, because you need both is the point of the Tao. There's actually like, so Nietzsche actually like talks about this in like Beyond Good and Evil, like this kind of like concept, not the Tao directly, but essentially that you can't see life as black and white. You have to kind of like find your individual path, which is where I think he talks about this concept called will to power, where essentially you as an individual need to come up with your own philosophy and your own way of thinking about the world and viewing the world, because like contextually you could come up with a philosophy that says lying is always bad. But if a Nazi asked you like, where's your brother so I can kill him, are you gonna lie or are you gonna tell the truth? Well, I'm gonna freaking lie to that guy, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like that. But I think that oftentimes the problem is it requires much more time, a higher sense of consciousness, and like an awareness of yourself in order to both articulate and calculate what you're actually like looking at. You need to be honest with yourself. You have to use the data points of your own life to kind of figure out, am I doing this too much or doing this not enough or something like that? And so if we look at the Tao, essentially it's like the black and the white side, right? Essentially what the Tao actually is the line in the middle, to my understanding of it, is that a person who is on, the Tao literally means the way in Chinese. Like if you actually is like, oh, that's the Tao, like this is like the path, right? The path, the way is the way to describe it. So the Tao is actually that snake-like S in between the two places, where what the Tao is a person who walks in between the yin and the yang. So not completely in chaos, but not completely in order. So essentially but one thing is represented by the dots within the colors themselves, is that within each is the other. So too much tyranny, you could say, or too much order would lead to a chaotic state. But within the feminine, which is, within chaos, that's where new things come from. So it's like Jordan Peterson talks about this, where a proper state of being is to have 1 foot in the unknown and 1 foot in what you know. So it's like he references this one image of like an old wizard or something like that, that's kind of like just peeking out to like the nebulousness of space and mystery and everything like that, while he still has like his feet grounded in reality, like in his kingdom, in what he knows in this farmland, which farmland's an interesting thing to see in a painting, because you could interpret it as like essentially organized nature, which is like, this is where they talk about like the ideal existence of a human is a walled garden, talking about that thing where it's like a person who has learned to live in nature and manage it, but still recognizes that he's not like in a factory floor. Like he still has to be part of nature, but he lives in a structurized nature that he controls. He has this symbiotic relationship with the nature of things, right? So,
dude, you're blowing my mind, man.
Yeah.
I never heard the Tao explained as the line in between that.
Yeah,
man, that's
it's the
good.
way, it's the path.
Right,
So,
right. Well, dude, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I notice, or that I take from it, is like how do you know about Hermeticism and those ideas?
Remind me.
Oh, it's just like the 7 principles of the universe, and it's all supposed to be the same rule, just broken down so that we can understand it. And it's like, the law of polarity, the law of frequency, the law, just like these ways of the universe that are supposed to give you an insight on how the nature of reality works. Mm-hmm. And one of the things it talks about is, I think, the law of polarity, where it's saying how love and hate are essentially the same thing, just to varying degrees. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing as like the Tao, right? Where there's the white and the black, and then the black and the white. And so it's like how, if you love something, you're going to experience hate for that thing, right? And if you hate something, you're going to experience love for that thing. And if you just, right, the same thing like temperature, hot and cold, it's just, you can experience cold as hot, mm-hmm. right? So if you, the typical dip your hand in the...
Yeah, you dip your hand in it, it almost feels like it's burning. It's kind of a weird thing. It's kind of like another comparison is, maybe it's not to sidetrack too much, it's like chocolate and vanilla when they think of them as opposites, but they're both really sweet. Like, the opposite of chocolate really isn't vanilla. We just look at the coloration as the difference. But most things about those two flavors are the same. Like, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's just like, so they're not really opposites. They're only opposite in 1 degree. You know what I mean? So the same thing with cold and hot. They're still feelings. Like the absence of feeling anything would be the opposite of essentially hate and love together is just passion. So essentially the opposite of passion is really what the question is. Like, so it would be nothing. The absence of feeling anything, and then those two are passion. It's funny. I've heard some people whose romantic tactics to like entice women is that they'll actually think if they can get them angry, you can generate an emotional response, and then you can get them to like you once you kind of flip it on them. But it's actually kind of funny because I've heard this study before or something reference to this. I'm not saying that I read a bunch of papers, but it's they say that if when you meet somebody you don't like them at first, and then once they can kind of convince you to like them, you like them more intensely than if you just liked them from the get-go. So it's an interesting thing like that. So it's really just like you take like passion and then you intensify that passion even more because you're building it on a base of like an established sense of it already. So
yeah. Well, same in line with what you're saying about how love and hate is passion. Well, you're nailing it for one, but it's that same idea where like I've heard people say this, and I think I've read it somewhere where that the opposite of love is not hate, but it's actually indifference.
Isn't that a love lyric? That's like a song lyric or something.
Oh, I guess it could be.
I don't know, but you know somebody's made a song about it.
Yeah. Where, where it's like when the person that you're with or whatever just doesn't care, that's the true opposite.
That would be the point of like, wow, we've really messed up. Like, I don't care. Like
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
If they hate, they actually do care. So it's in that kind of sense, right?
Yeah. And then so like, are there any other like, I guess, philosophies that you try to incorporate in your life? Like, for example, I don't know if you know anything about Alan Watts, but he was like one of the prolific Western philosophers to really explain Eastern philosophy. Because I feel like it's really important for us to take these foreign concepts and try to integrate them into like our Western society, because it's so easy to be like like the Tao sign, right? It's like, oh, that means love and hate, and it's like so surface level of what it can mean.
It's superficial, yeah.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't have the appropriate amount of depth necessary to it to use it. But the thing is that you have to understand ideas, just like people, can be viewed in varied degrees of sophistication. You could say that. Thing about some people are just not going to be that deep. Like unfortunately, being a little cynical, is that maybe seeing the Tao as love and hate is only accessible to people who are just not going to be that in-depth of a minded person. But I think it takes quite a bit of searching, and we can. I guess what I'm really saying is not all people are going to like give the same amount of time to ideas, because I don't think they have the ability to. People with higher intelligence are probably going to look more deeply into the Yin and Yang thing. They're going to see the nuance and sophistication because maybe for whatever reason they have the aptitude, whereas other people don't. And I think religion is a very interesting thing if you look at it like a tool, because some religions, you could say, like probably the more mainstream ones, you can have someone who's just a Joe Schmo, not that like a sophisticated minded person, can appreciate a thing like Christianity or Islam or something like that, and practice it and get meaning from it. But then you can have someone who's also very, very intelligent, and they can be religious, and they can look into the greater depths of these religions and then still get something out of it. But it all depends on kind of what the spiritual nutrition that each of those people need, if that makes sense. So it's like that's one of the great things about these great ways of thinking, or these religions or something like that, or philosophy may not so much, but I'm saying religion, is that they're rewarded for the depth that they go, but they only need to go, like it's like the ignorance is bliss thing. Like I think a person who's really intelligent is probably going to look really deeply into these things, because they can't be happy with just a superficial understanding of what they're believing in. But some people who don't need that, and there's nothing wrong with being unintelligent, I should also say. I think people oftentimes consider intelligence akin to like how morally good you are. But honestly, I'd rather hang out with a really cool, honest, dumb guy than a really like malevolent, intelligent person, right? Sure. Who's not real, and there are, I think that's actually a very common thing we see today. But that's kind of like one of the beauties of religion, is that it's kind of there for everybody. So I understand why I think a lot of people believe in religion, even if you can meet them as really intelligent, because I think they do a good way of tapping into truisms, you could say, essentially philosophies of ancient time that were found to be very reliable to survive. And I think oftentimes maybe some weird nuanced philosophies that we get into today it's almost like they're like a luxury philosophy in the sense that life is so good that you can believe in that. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's just like, really? It's just like, so I wonder is like, how well fed do you have to be to believe in something that sophisticated versus a really simple thing? Like, people oftentimes demonize religions. Like, I wouldn't say that I follow any particular religion, but I have a lot of respect for people who have the discipline to follow one. Like, because I think that if you were going to be a betting man, or if, let's just say, you're trying to live the best, most meaningful life, I think it would be better to choose to be religious than to not be religious. Because I think that, like I was saying with the Tao is the way, and you could say that's akin to being in the zone. So I think that people who just say, okay, I'm going to live a life as though God exists, probably are in the Tao a lot more than people who say God couldn't exist. You know what I'm saying? Because as soon as they connect to something, they're like, oh, what is this? It makes them question it, you know, at least to agnostic kind of perspective, if that makes sense. You mentioned earlier, you're like asking me about philosophies that I've kind of been into. I don't think it's like we're really limited to Eastern and Western thought. I know some people would disagree with me, but the more ancient I go, the more similar I find Western and Eastern thinking. Maybe only in more recent time periods, but you could also say that the cultures were more connected back then. Like, if you go back to like Aristotle, right? I don't think he's really saying stuff that's not too dissimilar to what Eastern religion or Eastern philosophy would describe. So he always talked about this thing called eudaimonia or eudaimonia, whichever way you say it, which means to have a happy demon, is what it means. But he considered that kind of like his goal in life, is to seek to have a happy demon, is the way you describe it, which I think they're saying is akin to the soul. And he kind of talked about two methods of achieving that, which we're seeing already a dualistic principle enact when he says two different things. And one is that of the scholar, and then one of that is the craftsman. So essentially what he's doing is that he uses each of these kind of like a foot walking towards eudaimonia, that essentially when he doesn't know enough, he has to be a scholar and learn more. But then when he learns enough, he has to learn to become the craftsman. What the craftsman is essentially the ability to apply skills or knowledge in a form of a skill. So you can think of it like in Jiu Jitsu. You need to learn something. The first thing you have to do is be a scholar, right? Like, so I learn leg locks, I learn a sweep, I learn this. But then you get to a point to where it's not sufficient enough to deal with all the problems and dilemmas that happen in Jiu Jitsu. So essentially you have to keep learning more, but you keep basically filling up, but you're infinitely approaching this concept of eudaimonia in the sense. I'm not saying jiu-jitsu by itself can help you achieve eudaimonia, but it's kind of like an apex of a pyramid you could think of, that we're all trying to infinitely approach, but you can't really get to. Essentially eudaimonia can be essentially aligned with any other sense of transcendence, like that any other philosophy has. But everybody's always had the idea of transcendence in like literally any religion or any philosophy, maybe not any philosophy, but essentially some state of perfection that's at the apex of moral hierarchy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, you're going super deep.
Yeah, like I'm just kind of riffing right now with the ideas, so.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I like what you said about how religion can be seen as a tool. And I heard this one guy say that, you know, without jiu-jitsu and his faith, he wouldn't be a guy that anyone would like. And that makes a lot of sense, in this idea that, religion can be this, or not religion per se, but that we as men or as humans need these guiding principles. And where you get those from, it can be many different things, but that we do need some type of guiding principles because our inherent nature, can lead us off the path, right? So it's like if you're, whether you have had trauma growing up or, you experience trauma, like I feel like most people on a regular basis are going to experience trauma. Like that's just kind of like the nature of our reality, in a sense that like, not everyone's going to be nice to you, and you're not always going to have good events happen to you, and there's going to be inherently tough things that are going to happen to you that you're going to have to figure out. And it can be extremely important to have like, to believe in Stoicism, to believe in Christianity, to believe in Catholicism. It's like these things, because if you only go by your human nature, that human nature can be to survive, and you can talk yourself into doing some pretty fucked up things for the sake of survival, or what you believe that you need in order to survive. So he was just saying that like jiu-jitsu and faith keep him like in this line of
keep him there, like keep him on the good path.
Right, and that's kind of what you were saying, how religion 100%. Can be a tool.
But I think one of the things, though, is that oftentimes I find that many philosophies in more of the recent era, the last few hundred years, they almost forgo that we're still animals. And that's kind of a gift as much as it's a curse. Essentially that we have certain mechanisms in us to recognize like things like you know, we all kind of got like a gut feeling. That's not really logical, but it usually allows us to know if something is amiss, right? I can get up and I can be like this doesn't feel right. But logically speaking, you could say without real evidence or something, or maybe there is evidence that I've missed, but there's something subconsciously within me that is pinpointing it and kind of telling, hey, consciousness, wake up and look into this more. You know what I'm saying? So I think that most people are kind of that war between their subconscious and their conscious nature, where essentially the consciousness is like the masculine aspect of your thinking, where subconscious is the feminine.
Right.
Where it's oftentimes I feel like people don't have them aligned well enough to where they can read their subconscious and be like, what is really going on? What am I dealing with here? Like, why am I really getting angry all the time? Or why do I get frustrated with this? And I think that's oftentimes why we see archetypically why men and women respond the way they do to certain situations, because I do think women tend to be the that's where femininity is occupies the most, is within women, which is why we make the association between feminine and women. Whereas I think typically men they have more of a masculine nature, but it doesn't mean they don't have feminine and masculine within each of them. I just think that we have a complementary dualistic society, and it's not just about guys, it's not just about girls, but essentially we're supposed to complement each other in this nature by becoming specialists in masculinity and femininity. I don't think it can really, in my opinion, I guess, or my experience, like it's better if a guy kind of becomes better at being masculine and then he's complemented by someone who specializes in femininity, and then they come together at that point to kind of occupy that. But what that represents more to a psychological level would be a master of the subconscious and a master of the conscious, like your consciousness and them coming together. So masculinity being a master of the consciousness, maybe you could say the spoken thought, like the ability to verbalize things and articulate, whereas the subconscious master here comes in and can communicate, maybe this is what you're thinking deep down, this is like where this is going, and then they can come together to verbalize the full stream of consciousness from top down and bottom up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
well, I noticed, my girl Tori, she's a next level person, like very intelligent. And I don't know if you have any experience in psychedelics, but and not even just psychedelics, but just like trippy experiences in general, just about life. And I find that I felt like I was able to get meaningful experiences out of life by myself, but when I experience things with her, she has like her own perspective on things, and it just literally opens up my mind to so much more. And it's like, what you're saying is when we combine the two perspectives, both feminine and masculine, that's where like the true knowledge is. It's like I have my own way of seeing things, and I can definitely get answers and move forward. But when combined with hers, it's like not even on the same level.
Well, yeah, you're more powerful in that complementary relationship. Like essentially, I would say that's an application or a way that we can really look at dualism, like the idea of dualism, where there's these opposites that complement each other to form the Tao, kind of coming together. It's an interesting thing that kind of what you're alluding. I remember I was talking to somebody recently, and sometimes I think guys get kind of like criticized for being a little harsh sometimes or something like that. And I was kind of thinking about that. It's like, that's because I think a lot of the time our job is to be a hammer in a relationship. Not like that we're going to be mean or anything like that, but I think your skill, like the thing is that we have to become specialists. Whereas like a girl, you could say, is more like a flower. Like you could say, but by them trying to be less of a flower and more like a hammer makes them a less good flower. Just like me trying to become like more of a flower makes me a less good hammer. So the thing is that if you need me to be a hammer, I can't try to be a little bit of everything. You know what I mean? It's also not within my nature. I think that biologically we're just driven to be a certain way, and that it's just kind of like, hey, if you're naturally good, it's like if I was really good at basketball, I would just do basketball. Like, you know what I mean? You should. You're like 7 feet tall. Why not? Go for it. Like you already have all the skills. You could do other things and be a specialist in the other way, but practically there's only so much time on this earth, so you might as well just be good at the things that you're kind of drawn to. Plus also, ironically, we feel a sense of fulfillment when we do the things that, when we win, when we do well at stuff. So you're probably going to like doing what you're naturally gifted towards anyway, right? So
100%, dude. Well, dude, I appreciate you coming and talking to me, man. And what are some ways, like, if someone was interested by your, well, first, I want to ask you a question. So let's say you got a white belt or someone really liked this podcast and they want to know, like, you know, their first step into, like the first step into knowing more, you would say, or just like bettering themselves as a person, because you're a very accomplished grappler and just in life. Like one good tip that you told me, and I feel like is a good secret for a lot of people, is like you said one of the reasons you got into dancing was to like meet people and meet women. And it's like, dude, so many people, so many guys struggle to meet women, you know, and that's something that they want to do, and they go about it in such a bad way, whether it's just like going to the bar or like,
yeah, we're in the Tinder culture today.
Right.
Like everybody's got these non-organic ways of meeting people. Admittingly, I've done that kind of stuff, you know, but it's like so your question is like how to meet girls? Or?
Well, no, I was just giving that as an example.
Yeah.
But if someone like wants, you know, the first step into bettering themselves, what would you tell them?
Read books, explore ideas, be open-minded, but also realize that you have to figure out that there are certain things that you have to have as core tenets of your life. You know, and when you're young, you can get away with that a lot more, but as you get older, you got to realize, are you moving forward? And you can judge the power of an idea based off if you think of it like a tool. So essentially, imagine some goals in mind, and then when you think a certain way, think of it like, this tool really helped that situation for me to move forward faster. Keep using it. And then if you find a better tool, use that tool instead. So you can judge a tool based off of the results it gives you. So if you think of ideas like tools, try to use the best tools.
Yeah. What book would you recommend someone to read? Like one of your favorites that impacted you a lot? You're bringing up Macbeth earlier. I've never even.
Yeah, but it's a book. Like, I mean, I'll watch movies even if I don't think I'll like them because I want to have cultural references to them. Like, I'll be like, oh, watch this. And it's like, it's mostly because I know somebody some later is going to reference Bob from that movie and I want to know what they're referring to so I understand the archetypical context or something.
Right.
So I'll be like, oh, it's good to be, you know, in the culture of the day because you could understand it. Some books, Beyond Good and Evil, I recommended that. I thought that was a really interesting book. It's really hard to read though because it's, but like honestly, some of the best books I've read are things like Moby Dick, Catcher in the Rye, like a lot of those kind of classics. But so I'd say that those are some of my favorites I've read. Count of Monte Cristo, they're just really cool books. And I guess I kind of like older books a lot of the time that could still feel like they were written today. Like they just translate. So to me, I feel like those writers hit a chord with people that were just like beyond the time period. They weren't just trying to write a political commentary at the time. They were kind of like commenting on the human experience. So those, as far as like fiction goes, read the classics. I think that those are universally good. You could read a book today and it's not like you couldn't get anything out of it, but I think classics have kind of proven themselves to be, you know, useful in some way, at least as a reference point for other humans' experiences. As far as nonfiction goes, Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche, Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand. That one's like how to objectively analyze art. That's really interesting. Things like that, but really just exploring ideas is just cool in general. Like, yeah, there's a lot of good podcasts, got a lot of good lectures and stuff online. Jordan Peterson has a really good psychoanalysis of the biblical stories.
Right.
I think that's totally underwatched for whatever reason, and I think that's his best content. I think that's the coolest stuff. Everybody always talks about making a bed and stuff like that. That's superficial. It's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to it. Also, if you're a guy, Patrice O'Neal's amazing. Listen to him. So Patrice O'Neal, yeah. So just a lot of stuff, but go into it with an open mind, nuanced perspective, and I think you'll be good. So keep trying.
Dude. And I guess so if people wanted to reach you, I know you're on Instagram and you post some cool posts on there and your Jiu Jitsu on there. Anything else that you would want to drop?
It's really just Instagram. I don't have anything else going. Maybe one day I'll do a YouTube thing or something. But it's Abraham_the_mountain. I know I'm not that tall. My last name just means the mountain, so that's why I call myself that. So follow me on Instagram. That'd be awesome to have you follow me.
Oh yeah, dude, I appreciate you, brother. Thank you.
It was fun.
See you guys later.